yet, what's the longest time you've ever waited for justice? Like, seriously, comment down below your longest wait for an apology or an explanation. Because if your answer is longer than the length of this video, well, then you need to buckle up. Because today we are talking about the Salem Witch Trials, America's darkest chapter. But before we dive into the chaos that ensued during those infamous trials, let's take a moment to get to know the time and place in which they happened. In the late 17th century, colonial Massachusetts was a theocracy. This means that the government was run by religious leaders who took their responsibilities very seriously. In fact, they were so zealous that they even held people accountable for breaking the law on Sunday. They believed that Satan was always looking for new followers and that witches were everywhere. So if something bad happened, they blamed it on witches. However, the situation became even more tense when a group of young girls started accusing people in town of practicing witchcraft and cursing them. Now, you might be thinking, how can we possibly blame the girls when they were just trying to protect themselves from being harmed? Well, that's a great question, but unfortunately, the answer is not so simple. You see, these girls were part of a community where religion played a central role in every aspect of life, including politics, economy, and culture. The Puritan community was built on the belief that humans were inherently sinful, and that God was both wrathful and merciful. They saw themselves as living in a constant battle between good and evil, with Satan and his demons always lurking around trying to tempt them away from the righteous path. And let's face it, living in such an environment was not exactly a walk in the park. The community members were constantly suspicious of each other's motives and actions, always wondering if their neighbor was truly a God-fearing person or a secret heretic. Women who did not conform to the rigid gender roles were often seen as suspicious, as they were seen as too independent and therefore possibly in league with the devil. Furthermore, the Puritan society was deeply affected by the events of the Salem Witch Trials of 1638, in which several women were accused of witchcraft. These trials resulted in the execution of 19 people, leaving a lasting impact on the community and setting a precedent for future accusations. As a result, when the young girls began exhibiting strange behaviors, the community quickly jumped to the conclusion that they must be afflicted by witchcraft. Unfortunately, the girls seemed to enjoy the attention they were receiving. After all, being chosen by God to communicate with the devil was a pretty big deal in their society. Plus, accusing others of witchcraft gave them an excuse to escape certain chores or responsibilities. For example, Abigail Williams, one of the main accusers, was known for making up stories about her cousin, Ann Putnam Jr., doing witchcraft and stealing her soul. This allowed Abigail to avoid doing housework and spend more time with the other girls. Now, you might be thinking, why didn't the adults step in and stop this madness? Well, let me tell you, it was not easy to go against the word of these young girls, especially when they were backed by Reverend Samuel Parris, the local minister who had a vested interest in keeping the trials going. You see, the trials brought him fame and fortune, and he wasn't about to give that up. without a fight. And while Abigail and her friends were having the time of their lives, others were not so lucky. Tituba, a slave, Sarah Good, a beggar, and Sarah Osborne, an elderly woman who lived alone, were among the first to be accused of witchcraft. But they became scapegoats for the community's fears and suspicions, ultimately paying the price for the crime of being different. In fact, being different was the only qualification needed to become an accused witch. Most of the accused were poor, elderly, female, or all three. In total, 148 people were accused of witchcraft during this time period, with the trials peaking in the spring and summer of 1692. Once accused, these individuals were subjected to a series of hearings in which they were expected to confess to their crimes and name their accomplices. If they refused to confess, they were put on trial and convicted based on the testimony of the girls. To make matters worse, they were not allowed to have legal representation during these trials. And judges refused to consider any evidence that could prove their innocence. To give you an idea of how unfair these trials were, let's look at the case of John Proctor. He was a farmer who was accused of attending a witch-s meeting in the forest with his wife, Elizabeth. Even though there was no evidence to support these claims, he was still found guilty and sentenced to death. When his wife also accused him of witchcraft, he realized that he would never receive a fair trial, so he decided to confess in order to save his own life. But after signing his confession, he immediately regretted it and tried to take it back. However, his confession was used against him at his trial, proving that he had indeed committed witchcraft. And tragically, he was hanged before he had a chance to clear his name. If you're thinking, wait a minute, didn't they hang people for stealing a loaf of bread back then? Well, you're not far off. In fact, one of the most bizarre aspects of the Salem Witch Trials was the evidence used to convict the accused. The girls claimed to see the devil in the form of a yellow bird and said that the witches would turn into animals and fly through the air. They also alleged that the witches would leave marks on their bodies, which would only appear under certain lighting conditions. The judges and community members alike took these claims seriously, even though they were completely unfounded. To make things worse, the punishments for being accused of witchcraft were brutal. If found guilty, a person could either be imprisoned or executed. And even if they managed to avoid the gallows, life in prison was not exactly a walk in the park. Many accused witches died of exhaustion and starvation due to the inhumane conditions. For example, Bridget Bishop, the first woman to be executed for witchcraft in Salem, was subjected to a show trial in which she was denied a lawyer and forced to stand before a judge who had already made up his mind about her guilt. She was eventually found guilty and hanged in front of a crowd of over 200 people. So, if you're feeling sorry for yourself right now, just remember it could have been much worse. You could have been accused of witchcraft in Salem. As the trials continued, the situation in Salem became increasingly chaotic. People were losing their minds, accusing anyone they could think of to save themselves. Accusations flew back and forth like arrows, piercing the hearts of innocent people and destroying families. And it wasn't until a year later that things started to calm down. By the end of 1693, the governor of Massachusetts had replaced the judges and ordered that all further accusations of witchcraft be handled by civil courts instead of by the clergy. The following year, 1697, the General Court formally ended the witch trials and ordered that those who had been imprisoned should be released and given financial compensation. Over time, the memory of the Salem Witch Trials has faded from public consciousness, but it remains an important reminder of what can happen when fear and superstition take hold of a community. In fact, the legacy of the Salem Witch Trials continues to resonate in American culture to this day. It serves as a cautionary tale of how mass hysteria and religious fundamentalism can lead to the persecution of innocent people, and it has inspired countless works of art, literature, and film. Furthermore, the trials have become a symbol of the struggle for justice in the face of overwhelming odds. The accused witches were ultimately vindicated, but not without suffering greatly. Their stories remind us of the importance of standing up for what is right, even when it is unpopular to do so. Finally, the Salem Witch Trials offer a lesson in the dangers of unchecked power. The judges and community leaders who presided over the trials abused their authority and failed to protect the rights of the accused. They allowed fear and prejudice to guide their decisions, resulting in the wrongful conviction and execution of many innocent people. This should serve as a reminder to be wary of those who wield power and to hold them accountable when they abuse it. Overall, the Salem Witch Trials were a dark chapter in American history, but they offer valuable lessons that can help us to create a better future. By learning from the mistakes of the past, we can work to prevent such atrocities from ever happening again. We hope you enjoyed learning about the Salem Witch Trials, one of America's darkest chapters. We'd love to hear your thoughts on the events that took place in Salem, and what lessons we can learn from this dark period in history. Don't forget to hit the like button if you're a fan of our videos. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.